Greetings. My name is Judith Black, and I'm here for 350 Mass. Welcome to Roadmaps and Roadblocks, Accelerating the Passage of Climate Legislation. That perfect name was given to us, Roadmap, by Sam Payne, our digital coordinator, who also is the magic behind all this happening. Thank you, Sam. All right. So at the end of the traditional session, our legislative session, uno solamente, important climate bill got through, the roadmap bill. And then within seconds, because it was the end of session, all of these climate bills got turned into amendments and tacked on, and then it got thrown into a committee. And now the most important piece of legislation, and yes, everything's important. The budget's important. COVID relief is important. Everything is important. But if we do not address the climate crisis, we can't look at anything else. So how can we get this legislation passed? That bill is now in a conference committee, and we have no direct access to it. And the conference committee is trying to blend the Senate and the House bill. How can we influence them? How can we get this through? This is what has brought us to today, our legislature. Mass 350 worked on 2 non-binding questions in the last election. And one of them was about, well, one was about 100% renewable energy, but the other was about transparency. And so far, 91% of the people in all the districts that question ran in said, yes, we want complete transparency. So that is across the board, but it is not something we have yet. Why isn't our legislature dealing with the most consequential issues we face? So let's get into it. Our first presenter is Craig Altemose. A little bit about Craig. He's the founding executive director of Better Futures Project, which organizes communities and campuses and coalitions to address the climate crisis through its programs. And one of its programs is 350 Mass, Divest Ed, and communities responding to extreme weather. That's called CREW. Before this, Craig co-founded and led Students for a Just and Stable Future. It's a statewide student network that engaged students at more than 15 Massachusetts universities on climate policy. Craig holds degrees from Eckerd College, the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and Harvard Law School. He's not only a brilliant integrative thinker, he knows how to put words and thoughts into action. He also makes a mean bean soup and is soon to be a daddy. So the question we asked him to address is kick us off with a modern grounding in how our legislature got to this place. Craig. And if you could spotlight Craig so we just see him, that would be great. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Judith, for that very kind introduction. It's great to see so many folks on the call. I think a lot of familiar faces or names, and great to be joined by Rep. Robinson and Greg here as well. Yeah, so I was actually asked to give an overview of the history of the Massachusetts legislature. And I think, all histories are inherently subjective because of what you include and do not include. And obviously in 10 minutes, I'm not gonna be able to give an exhaustive, comprehensive history. But just to note, it's actually Massachusetts state legislature first officially convened in London in 1629, something I learned. But was assumed its modern form in 1780 with the adoption of the Massachusetts Constitution, which is actually the oldest living constitution in the world. It was the model for the U.S. Constitution that was kicked off in 1789. So anyway, that's the fun facts, the original parts. But jumping forward several centuries to mostly modern day, unfortunately, our legislature has had several issues in a long history of corruption. So as many of you may know, but as many people are surprised to learn, the previous 3 speakers of the House of Representatives of Massachusetts were all federally indicted on corruption. And the current Speaker of the House was an unindicted co-conspirator in the previous Speaker's corruption trial. You have to go back to 1991 to have a Speaker of the House leave office willingly, not under the cloud of criminal suspicion. And it's worth noting again that the current speaker, who was elected after 3 back-to-back bouts of corrupt speakers pledged to only serve 4 terms because people appreciated that the office as it is currently structured was too powerful. And so he agreed to, the legislature installed term limits back in 2010 that would prevent anyone from holding a position more than 4 terms, 4 2-year terms. And we are now closing out the 5th term of the current speaker, Bob DeLeo. So, at the start of his 4th term, I believe it was, there was, a motion to withdraw the term limits. It looks like he will at least be starting a 6th term. Though, there are rumors of retirement, but we have heard those before as well. Yeah, and I think it's worth noting the state Senate is not historically immune from corruption. That the longest serving Senate president in history was William Bulger, who is the brother of the crime lord Whitey Bulger. And while I don't know of any explicit charges of corruption, it's hard to imagine that if your brother is a crime lord that you don't have some seekage there. But anyways, so, I think this is an office that, again, holds a lot of power. And basically the speaker, I think the rep can correct me, the speaker basically unilaterally decides who holds all of the different committee positions, the committee chairs and vice chairs. And the totality of committee chairs and vice chairs make up a majority of the Democratic caucus. And being a chair and a vice chair is not just something that is a nice feather in your cap, although it is a very nice feather in your cap to go back to your district and brag about. But yeah, you get paid more money, so it directly influences your salary and influence the number of staff that you're able to hire, which allows you to do more constituent services. And there's also other things like the location of your office building, your office within the building, which is again not irrelevant with having a nice big office to impress your constituents versus a crummy one down in the basement, or other levers of power that the speaker uses to enforce discipline within the state house. But to look at climate as an issue, so as Judith named in my biography, I got involved in the climate fight here in Massachusetts when I moved here for graduate school in 2006. I really didn't start getting really involved in 2007, but I was part of the effort to pass the Global Warming Solutions Act, and that basic effort saw the Senate pass it. I forget exactly when, but I think sometime in the spring, maybe February or March or April, sometime around then, in the last year of the session. So maybe like 3 to 5 months left to go. And as we have unfortunately seen the pattern emerge, that the Senate passed it, and then we waited, and then we waited, and then we waited. I think it was around July 28th of 2008 that the House brought the Global Warming Solutions Act to the floor for a vote. And when it reached the floor, it was passed unanimously. Even the Republicans voted for it. And this is arguably the most aggressive climate law in the nation, and the linchpin of Massachusetts' current climate laws on the books. And it again passed like July 28th at like midnight, when the session ended July 31st. And the reason it passed was because the speaker decided unilaterally to let it come to the floor for a vote. But he almost didn't. And this was the previous speaker, DeMasi. But if he had not let the bill come to a floor, even though every single representative was willing and many were eager to vote for it, it would not have passed into law. The bill would have died, and we would have seen no Global Warming Solutions Act enacted into law that session. And that, under the current speaker, we've seen further evidence of this, where again in 2016, 2018, the Senate passes what I would qualify as a B climate bill, like a letter B grade, pretty good. I think it's hard to pass phenomenal climate bills for my metrics with the urgency and the scope and scale of climate change, but passed really solid climate bills. And both in 2016 and in 2018, then the House took a small chunk of that and weakened the chunk that they took and passed that. And then basically the conference committees were such that the House said to the Senate, well, okay, you passed your big bill. Here's our small bill. We're happy to talk about making the small bill into law, or we can just do nothing. It's up to you. And so then the Senate generally would say, okay, let's do the small bill so we have some climate action, and then the House version would generally prevail and become law. And that happened again in both 2016 and 2018. In 2016, there was a bill to carve out renewable energy for offshore wind. The 2018 bill was slightly more robust. It had a number of provisions, including increasing the renewable energy portfolio standard, the amount of energy utilities are required to buy from renewable sources, among some other provisions around methane leaks and other good things. But again, I think there's a lot that was carved off that the Senate had passed that the House said, we don't want to talk about that. That's off the table. And I will say that there was a lot of frustration within our climate community, particularly after 2018, after 2 sessions in a row of this happening. And we did, as a climate community, come together and help elect someone who was originally supposed to be in this panel, Representative Nika Elagardo, who defeated Jeffrey Sanchez, who at that time was the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, and who was played a key role in helping to weaken that climate bill that passed in 2018. And in the intervening 2 years since then, we actually have seen the House pass 2 climate bills. Speaker DeLeo, for the first time in his history, wrote his own climate bill, GreenWorks, which he pushed through the House fairly quickly and aggressively. And then toward the end of this session, again, the House passed the roadmap bill, which I think we'll be discussing further and has been named already, which for me was very exciting because it was the first time that I felt like the House bill and the Senate bill were not on wildly different pages. That the House bill actually was better than the Senate bill in some places. The Senate bill is also better than the House bill in some places. But to me, like a really key learning point from that was, there were some folks who told us that, but by directly challenging the power of the Speaker, that we would expect to be punished as a community, and that no climate stuff would get passed in the 2019 to 2020 session because of our brazen, attack on one of the Speaker's top lieutenants in Jeff Sanchez. And in fact, we did see 2 climate bills passed through the House. And so I do think I'm a firm believer in the notion that power concedes nothing without a demand, and that we have to be willing to there are no slides. I apologize, Roy. The short version is the Senate has been passing good bills. The House has been passing less good bills, but still not horrible bills. But this session we have two pretty decent bills that the House and Senate have both passed that we are waiting to bring into being. And yeah, I mean, I guess I think I'm running low on time here, so I will just lift up the fact that the climate change is continuing to get worse. Obviously, with each passing year, we have more heat waves, more hurricanes, more wildfires, more droughts, more floods, and most likely on the horizon, more pandemics as the Arctic melts and releases the new viruses and bacteria into the world that have been frozen for tens of thousands of years. And so the public pressure for climate action is not going to go away. It's going to continue increasing until the legislature, both federally and here in the state, deals with it accordingly. And there are no term limits for senators, reps, or the Speaker of the House. Those were the one term limit that was set was for the Speaker, and that was again repealed. So anyway, I think we'll chat more in the Q&A, but I will yield the rest of my time here.
Thank you, Craig. Actually, DeLeo was the one who got term limits ended a few years ago. He got that passed right through. Well, I have a term limit. All right, thank you. That is some of our history. Let's just take a quick look at that first question. And do you remember how you answered it? Well, here are the answers. Among the recent and popular bills listed on the official Mass legislative website, the 2 that are not included, I'm so sorry to say, is the one act that would direct fossil fuel companies to pay a fee for pollution, and an act that facilitates the electrification of public transit. It's not considered deeply significant. Hope you won them both. Now, Sam, want to just flash the second question, and then I will introduce Maria. So we had initially lined up Nika Elagardo to be on this, but she had an accident, and working on the budget just exhausted her, and it was just too much. And she was wonderful and found us someone with a brilliant energy background who has spent as much time in the legislature as she has. So, oh, good. Now we can actually answer them. Oh, right. Of course, Craig gave you the answer to this already, sort of. But fill it out. And meanwhile, I'm going to introduce Maria Robinson to you. And I'm sorry Nika couldn't be with us, and happy to have Maria. Maria comes to us from the 6th Middlesex District, better known to all of us as Framingham. She has a degree from MIT in chemical engineering. Nika went to MIT too. I wonder, did you know each other there? Nah, too bad. She's a master's from the University of Tulsa in energy law. She's held many high-powered positions in the energy sector prior to entering the legislature. And she's an advocate for rail trails, understanding how important it is to transition out of our vehicles and into other modes of transit. And okay, ask me, go ahead, say, where is she on transparency? I heard you asked, where is she on transparency? Go to her website. Unlike our legislature, Maria Robinson on her website logs in every single vote she makes. She is a believer in transparency. Facts, she must like the Brits because she named her dog Guinness. She plays a knock-dead good piano, and she's also an award-winning musical director. So we asked her to talk about what it was like to advocate on the outside versus the inside of the chamber. And how does the culture of the House affect the work you do? And why can't we get through powerful climate bills? Maria.
Thank you so much, Judith, for that lovely introduction. Our dog came from a rescue, so he did come with the name already, but be perfectly honest with you. But I think Craig's introduction really spotlights a lot of the reasons why it's difficult to get things done around here. We have a reputation here in Massachusetts of being incredibly progressive, on the cutting edge. And I think what is sometimes not recognized is, we had a strong advocate in Governor Patrick, who really pushed a number of efforts when he was in charge of the state. And while there has been some strong push forward, a lot of these structural issues remain that don't necessarily happen in other states. I had the great fortune of working in about half of the country's legislatures as an advocate prior to becoming a state representative myself. And I had always really believed in the committee process, and that the bill with the most votes gets done at the end of the day. And it's not necessarily that straightforward of a process here in Massachusetts, the way that we see it in other states. And I think part of that is because we have been such a long-standing institution. When you are in a building that has been there for quite as long as that State House has, and recognizing that your original charter came from the 1600s, it's much more difficult to change than in states that were founded when my parents were alive. So I think that there are some cultural issues associated with that. And as you all know, we've had a veto-proof majority in both the House and the Senate. This next session, there will be exactly 3 Republicans in the Senate out of the 40 senators as a whole. So one would think that really good progressive legislation would sail right through. But just because someone has a D next to their name does not necessarily indicate that they're going to be supportive, the way that you might find in actually much more conservative states where the Democrats are more aligned, in large part because Republicans are offering really awful options. We've seen that happen all across the country. But in the same way that is actually just today, I was reading about how the FBI went through the Ohio Public Utility Commission chair's house as part of a large scandal that happened with the Speaker of the House there. But I was talking with a colleague in Ohio, and they said, the Speaker of the House got indicted by the FBI. He was a Republican, and the Republicans lost exactly 1 seat in this last election, despite that level of corruption. So it's not necessarily that elections are doing the work to root out any sort of corruption. It's really hard. People are not necessarily incredibly engaged in politics, even here. Those of you who are here tonight, thank you for coming out and for being engaged and interested. But you're in a rarefied group of people. Not everyone gets out there and writes their state representative on a regular basis. We hear from the same couple dozen people maybe on issues who are really engaged and focused on what's happening in the legislature. But for the most part, people trust us to do what we think is right. And there isn't necessarily a great way to hold people individually accountable in the same way that you might in the US Congress. One of those reasons that I'm sure we'll talk about at length later is because of the lack of transparency around committee votes in particular. There are no rules in place that mandate that committee votes have to be made public. I do that. Representative Lindsay Sabadosa puts it on her website. Senator Rebecca Rash puts them on her website. We might be the only three that actually proactively put them on our website, and then a handful of others will answer how they voted. But otherwise, you don't know if something was voted on in committee or how someone voted on it. And that can really make it hard for people who want to advocate, but are not advocates as a full-time position, to pay attention to what's going on, which is why it's great that there are organizations like 350 who are doing that type of work and helping to engage folks. But that makes it really hard for both accessibility and accountability on behalf of individual constituents who care about different issues. The other thing that I struggle with is climate is always in the top 3 of issues, but is rarely number 1. And I think that we see that not just here in Massachusetts, but nationwide. I remember back in 2008, 2009, climate was in the top 5 issues for the Obama administration, but healthcare was the number 1 issue. And they got healthcare through, and after all of that political capital was spent, it made it hard for climate to come after that. And so I think sometimes we run into the same issue here, where it is quite simply not prioritized as a top issue compared to other things that are going on, right? Just this week, the House really wonderfully, I'm very proud of us, pushed forward with expanding abortion access rights. And hopefully the Senate will follow as well. But in many ways, we passed that, and it's a higher priority despite it being a very risky vote for a lot of folks, and one that's very, very controversial, obviously. But we voted on that before we voted on electrifying the T. And so that just gives you a sense of the prioritization of some of those issues. And so the other thing that I want to point out is that I think my class of 2018, of which Nika Elagardo, Tammy Gouveia, Lindsay Sabadosa, Trom Wynn, Dave LaBeouf, were electing more progressive young people as a part of that. And that is important because I do think leadership was reacting to having a more progressive caucus, and not just from places like Cambridge and Somerville, but from places like Worcester and Andover and Framingham, where they might not have heard that previously. And that continues to be essential work to make sure that we're the speakers hearing from progressive voices all over the state. I think I've gone well over my time at this point, so we're good. All right. A couple other things that I do want to point out, as Craig very well phrased. The chair and vice chair situation is a little bit more complicated, for sure. We assume that it's like Congress, but it's not like Congress. In Congress, everyone gets paid the same, and then you have additional responsibilities of being a chair or vice chair. Here, your pay is tied to your assignments. Your committee assignments are determined by leadership, your staff allocation. So many of us just have one staff person helping with everything from unemployment claims to writing legislation to doing press releases. And other things are determined by that as well, including your office location, which for some is more bothersome than others. I enjoy being in my basement apartment, but there is a lot of motivation to not necessarily rock the boat. And I think that is what is difficult here, is that for a lot of people, they work really, really hard to get to this position. And it's hard to push for something, especially if it's uncomfortable. And many of these conversations are really uncomfortable, but we are in positions of power. And I think recognizing that is the first step, as are all of you. I had a constituent write to me recently saying something about your boss, the speaker. And I said, no, the speaker's not my boss. You're my boss. I have 40,000 bosses, which is a very complicated job to have 40,000 bosses, including 4 that live in my house with me, who I hear from more than anybody else about their feelings on everything. And so that we have to make sure that the power is really with the people, and that you understand that you are the people paying taxes to fund my salary. You are the ones who elect me every 2 years, and it is really important that we make sure that folks understand that and don't feel helpless in this process, because you're not helpless. Every email and every phone call that you make to an elected official does matter. It may not feel like it, and the response may not feel like it matters, but it is part of a larger collection, and as voices amplify and get louder, I think you can make some really significant change by just taking that one step and grabbing a couple of friends along with you. So with that, Judith, I'll turn it back to you.
That was gorgeous. You so obviously speak from your mind and your heart at the same time. Thank you. Sam, would you put up that the screenshot of the 100% Club that I sent to you? So take a quick look at this and say, why is not Massachusetts on this? Okay, thank you. And what were the results of the number 2 survey question? Did you get those tallied? Oh, here they come. Well, Craig kind of gave you the answer already when in his thing, that of the 10 men, all white men who have been speakers, what percentage of them due to illegal activities were thrust out of office? Oh, wait, there we have them. Yay. Oh, see, you guys didn't realize how corrupt we really are. You voted for 30 instead of 40, which is the real number. Thank you. Okay. And I wanted us to see that before introducing our third panelist, because this is what he's going to address. So let me introduce you to Greg Nadeau. Greg, along with Anna Callahan and Bob Massey, has begun the very cleverly titled initiative, Cleaning House. What they maintain is, and I think we're seeing this, is that our House of Representatives is a uniquely undemocratic institution. Retired Watertown Rep Jonathan Hecht, he argued that even China operates a more open legislative system than we do. Greg is an innovative educator, he's a writer, he's a thinker, he's an activist who walks his talk. So I just have to tell you, when his son, Max, was a freshman in high school in Somerville, he and his best friend went and gave a testimony in support of carbon pricing, or if we must, carbon fee and dividend, at the State House. And Max played one of the 1%, kind of an older person with a big investment in fossil fuels who didn't want to be bothered by the money it would cost him if they passed this. And then his friend spoke pretty much as himself, explaining that if we don't do this, he won't have a future. He was a freshman in high school when he did that. He is now a sophomore in college. We still don't have carbon pricing. So Greg, when he was a senior in high school, wore a button. It said, question authority, and he's been doing it all his life. Our question to him is, please tell us more about cleaning house. We know why it's necessary, but if you could share some of the goals and strategies for getting there and how it will affect climate legislation, that would be great. Greg Nadeau.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Judith and Sam, for putting this forum together. Craig and Rep. Robinson for your excellent and thoughtful comments, and all of you fellow progressive activists here tonight for all that you do to help make the world a better, more just and equitable place. Since before the time I worked there in the early 90s, the Massachusetts House has been a truly unique, undemocratic institution among the 50 states. Currently, the full-time state reps now meet only occasionally on Wednesdays for part of the year, which is an 80% reduction from 10 short years ago. No matter how many progressive legislators dutifully co-sponsor bills and attempt to do their jobs, bills typically pass or fail from committee without any recorded vote and then go to these black box committees of third reading and ways and means, where staff alter them without any public process and determine which, if any, are brought to the full House for the vote. By the time a bill is brought to the full House, the supermajority Democratic caucus has already determined its fate, and the actual vote is a farce. House members that vote against the Speaker's will are threatened with loss of salary and power. Now, as Craig noted, the House remains so broken that the last three speakers have been convicted of felonies. And while the current speaker is a bit less clumsy, the culture in the House is no more open, deliberative, or effective. When we talk about change, we really only need to look no further than the state Senate in Massachusetts to see a legislative body that has recently reformed itself, creating a functional deliberative body, and which has reliably produced meaningful legislation more in sync with progressive values of the electorate. That change came about when the Senate stopped exclusively electing white, straight, male, Boston-based leaders. More than money, the source of power is parochial tribalism of power and privilege between the old Democratic Party core, from a generation past that no longer represents the diversity and breadth of the Commonwealth. The Leviathan has returned as the dominant political movement of our time. Strongman governance is nothing new or unique to America. Trump, Duarte, Bolsonaro, Putin, Xi, and DeLeo are nothing new or important on their own. What I'm going to talk mostly about is what gives them power, the enablers. It's not the bully, it's the bystander that gives real power to malice. Lindsey Graham, Marjorie Decker, Lori Ehrlich, Christine Barber, people who should know better, people who trade access to power for actual impact. And it's not just them. Last year, several of the most progressive groups remained neutral or supported incumbents in contested primaries where candidates promised to stand up to the House Speaker. It's all the individuals and statewide progressive groups that continue to support progressive allies that sell out the core issues for the elusive access to power, better office, and leadership bonus. Most importantly, it's every one of us. Like racism, I believe that we are either actively working to change the broken system or we are perpetuating the status quo. There is no in between. Legislators who back the Speaker's iron grip and then crow about co-sponsoring progressive legislation that goes nowhere are the problem. The problem is not with conservative House members. They're getting what they want. We need to tell our progressive reps that they are either with the Speaker or they're with climate action, social justice, sanctuary and protection for immigrants. There is no in between. It's time for a change. We need to demand bold aspirations and open debate and deliberation of ideas. So I believe that the best way for us to do this is to meet with progressive House members now and let them know that we'll be watching very closely what happens in January when the new body convenes, rules are approved, and leadership put in place. We need to make it clear that we will not support House members that vote for leaders that betray the public trust. Last spring, I met with Rep. Christine Barber to ask her about her thoughts about the House leadership. I was disappointed but not surprised to hear her say that she was not willing to stand up for rules reform and new leadership until there's broader progressive majority. While I've always liked and respected her very much, I let her know that I could no longer support any rep who votes to continue to support the current dysfunctional culture. So earlier this fall, a nascent movement began that we called Cleaning House. And our goal is not to create a new organization. Our stated mission is to work with Act on Mass, Progressive Mass 350, Incorruptibles, and other line groups to install a progressive speaker who encourages open deliberative debate and enacts critical legislation that represents the interests of all people, including specifically climate action, police reform, single-payer healthcare, and protection for immigrants. So we need to work to reform House rules, align key influencers, recruit and support primary challengers, and raise funds to Muntel-targeted support. And Judith, I would just say that while my son Max is a product of the house I grew up in, I see my mother Lynn on the phone on the session here, who some of you may know, and she is where I got my activism from. So thank you, Judith, Craig, and everyone.
As we like to say, the apple don't fall far from the tree. Thank you. And Greg does not mince words. So I think this is probably a really good place to post the Act on Mass information that I gave you, Sam. So Act on Mass has just begun a huge initiative to reform rules. And what they're planning to do is to get cohorts to address every single legislator in the state, so that, as Greg pointed out, you're not sticking your neck out alone. Nobody's willing to do that. It gets chopped off. But to really get a huge consensus of House members to say, these rules have to change. We want transparency, we want to accommodate people, and we want less power grounded right into the leadership role. So go to Act on Mass and look at that. They are looking for people all over the state to help with this. Okay, let's get everybody back online, and we have our first question to all our panelists. So, and unfortunately, Maria has to leave at 8, so that's why we're going to ask her to answer this first, because she has about 15, 20 minutes. We're doing well. Would you please talk about the rules? I don't think most people understand what the rules that are created in January do, the rules for the 2-year session, and how they determine the top-heavy leadership and the lack of transparency. So Marie, if you could respond to that first, talking about how we could best change the rules and how to make people aware of them.
Sure. So every 2 years, when a new session begins, both the House and the Senate take up a set of rules that will govern the way that debate and deliberation happens for the entire session. That happens at every level of government, but here it's particularly important in the House, in large part because so many bills, as previously mentioned, end up going through our own House Ways and Means, and kind of goes into a little bit of a black box where we're not really sure what's going on. And that's true for many reps in addition to the general public. And so there are certain measures that you can put into the rules, such as how many people it takes to stand up and agree to a public roll call, which means that a vote would be on the record with every rep having to vote yes or no. Right now, a lot of things pass via voice vote where it's just sort of gabbled in. It's like listening to a fast-moving auction, except on policy, where it's going by very quickly. There are other rules around how much time we have to read amendments or to file amendments, which can be really time limiting. As I mentioned before, some of us only have one staffer. And so if a big bill that's 100 pages comes out at 1 o'clock and amendments are due at 5 o'clock, that can be really difficult for those of us inside the building. And I know it's also difficult for those outside the building trying to understand what changes might have been made in that, and then find a rep to actually help sponsor some of the amendments that you're trying to see happen. And then, of course, as we've been talking about throughout, there are rules that govern how committees operate. And so we've been putting forward the past session and this session coming up, rules that would mandate that all committee votes be made public, whether they're posted on a website or if someone calls to ask how everyone voted on it. Those those would have to be made available to the public as well. And so those changes, while seemingly mundane or arcane, make a really big difference in terms of how we go about the job of legislating, and I think can be an important tool in both setting up the framework for the rest of the session and help to move forward some progressive policy by changing the way that advocacy works. I think one thing that I failed to mention, but if you actually look at our website, malegislature.gov, you'll see there are bills with over 100 co-sponsors, right? There are 200 legislators. So over 100 co-sponsors is more than half of the legislature supports it in some way, shape, or form. And there are some bills that have been having that many co-sponsors for several sessions now. And there's really no reason why those shouldn't at least come to the floor for a vote. And it tends to lessen the value of co-sponsorships, on which outside groups really rely on understanding if someone truly supports a bill or not. And so we want to make sure that, you know, these basic functions that people are relying on are real metrics of actual support from people who sign on. And so the rules are another way, I think, for us to better gauge that support, to help move progressive policies forward by making sure that there truly is that right level of support from people who say that they're supporting that work. Yes, like paid family leave. Paid family leave, I think, has, the last email I got was 115 co-sponsors, but we didn't vote on it in this last budget, even though someone put it forward as an amendment. And so that kind of change needs to happen. Now, there are people who do roll call. It's very much frowned upon. I've done it myself and been written up about it in the Boston Globe. And so it's not something that is for the weak-hearted, for sure. It might sound really straightforward to say, yes, we should be roll calling everything. But it is hard. We like our colleagues a lot. They're good people. But it is hard sometimes to be brave. And I think that is a real fundamental issue, is that we don't want to put our colleagues on the spot like that. We don't want to push them into a difficult decision, but at the same time, if that's what our constituents want us to be doing, then that's really the most important factor.
I hear you. You live in two houses now. The one at home and the big one, and you want to get along in both. So how does one do this without getting their head chopped off? Sam, could you just show the third question, which is completely part of this, our third survey question? And while you're doing that, just to know that Act en Masse, one of the three things they're asking for is a 72-hour period that people can read legislation before voting on it. I mean, that's sort of insane to ask people to do that in a half hour or an hour period. Here we go. So I mentioned Jonathan Hecht earlier. And I think you can probably guess which one it is.
I do want to be clear that he would fully support free ice cream. If there's one thing that I know about Representative Hecht, is that he has a great fondness for ice cream.
One of the great things in the world. Okay, so now while people are filling that out, let's get responses on the rules question from our other panelists. Craig, you had to have a rhyming name to be on this panel, but we let Maria because we liked her. Okay.
I would just start with, would seem to an outsider as a logical rule, which is if the majority of reps co-sponsor something, it should pass.
Some of them don't even vote for it. Some people co-sponsor and then don't even vote for it.
But just think of it as early voting, right, for a legislator. Like if you actually could just work with a rep and say, okay, well, you co-sponsor this, and you know that if you get to 81 co-sponsors, then you have legislation that passes.
So we have something that's called a discharge petition. That is a very, again, pretty arcane option that at least in talking to folks who've been here the last 10 years, has never been used. But theoretically, if you get 81 people to sign on to a discharge petition, you can get a bill out of Ways and Means for third reading. What that doesn't do is help you if you're trying to get a bill out of a substantive committee in order to move it along. So there are places where that gets stuck, but then oftentimes people will put more pressure then on that substantive committee. But yes, it is difficult because in many other places, co-sponsorship is a true sign of support. And here it is not always that same, it is certainly not to the same degree for each person who co-sponsors a piece of legislation. One of my dearest colleagues, Jack Lewis, I think has co-sponsored 800 out of the 7,000 bills, which is an enormous amount of legislation to co-sponsor.
So wait, I have a question here from Jim Malloy. Representative Robinson, what's the main argument your colleagues use to vote against these transparency issues? In particular, why are they against committee votes being public?
So committee votes being public is probably one of the more acceptable options. I think, again, it gets to a culture that is slow to change more than anything else, where it's just something that hasn't been done before. And it's a very, very deliberative body when it comes to change. Not saying that that's a good reason necessarily, but because it hasn't been done before. And also, I think for some folks in the committee process, we are given a recommendation by the chair on how to vote, whether something should pass or something should not pass. And typically, the assumption for many is that one would vote with the chair on everything. And it's not clear whether there would be any sort of either policy or political ramifications for you if you didn't do that. I've certainly not done that 100% of the time. But I think that can be, it's another difficult choice to make. And having to come up with a good response for why you did or did not support something can be really complicated in places where not all of your constituents are on the same page.
Okay.
And we vote on everything almost completely by email.
Oh, okay, because that's funny. There was just a question in here. Do they have electronic voting technology available to committees? And can it be done efficiently? Could it be quick and easy?
Yeah, it should be, and everything. We've talked to the House clerk about it, and they do collect the votes already, and it wouldn't be very difficult from an IT perspective to make them available online. But even now, if you called, in theory, one ought to be able to get those votes from folks.
Okay. Craig, did you want to respond to the rules?
I don't have too much to add. I think just to notify folks in case people weren't aware that the session is basically like an 19-month session. It goes from the January of the odd year until July of the even year. So the next term will run from January of 2021 until July of 2022. And the rules for that session are set in that first month in January. And so there are going to be a number of important votes happening this coming January to set the terms of debate and discussion for the next session. And in the last session, there were amendments offered to say give legislators, I don't know if it was 48 or 72 hours to read bills before they're asked to vote on it. And similarly, a shorter period of time, but a still reasonable period of time to read amendments before they're asked to vote on amendments. And those very common sense measures were soundly and roundly defeated by the Democratic majority, as I understand, under the direction of the Speaker. And I think now, a lot of legislators will use the excuse of, well, I didn't have time to read the full bill if constituents are angry at them for passing a bill. But they boxed themselves into that corner, that they voted against the option of having time to read every bill thoroughly, or have their staff read every bill thoroughly and brief them. So to me, that's not really a valid excuse, and there is going to be a more concerted effort to push for more substantive rules changes. I think the folks who did this the last session tried very hard, but were a little bit late in getting started, and so there's an effort to start earlier on that. And I think I would say reaching out to your representatives now and to encourage them to vote for greater transparency within the State House rules. Reach out to them today, tomorrow, this week, I think would be really appreciated and valuable.
The Act on Mass info is in the chat, so go on in there because they are on it. I have a question from Kurt Newton. What structural things can be done to diminish the outsized power of the House Speaker?
Sure. So there was an effort last year to normalize and standardize salaries, which I think would go a long way. And I'm not sure it was presented in a way that worked for a lot of people, because I do recognize that committee chairs do a lot of work and should be recognized for that. But I think similar to Congress, it should be an honor to be able to serve in that type of position. But many folks will get an additional stipend of $30,000, which could be really life-changing for a lot of people who are in public service and have student loans, right? And that can be a difficult choice personally to make, because we don't necessarily have the same opportunities. A lot of us now are really doing this full-time. Even though we are compensated as a full-time legislature, not everyone has always done only this work. Many folks have had additional outside work and compensation, so they didn't necessarily rely on the compensation from the state fully, but I think that plays a really big role. And also having more staff and having that normalized, even if we were able to access a legislative analysis crew or a budget review staff that everyone in the building had some access to, that would be pretty life-changing for a lot of folks inside the building.
In researching this, one of the things I discovered is that there has been no uptick in the money that supports staff for folks for ages. I mean, everything else gets money first, but you still have the same number of people helping you as you did a decade ago. So yeah, that has to change. It's too much to ask of one human. Other responses to this?
I mean, I think another one, again, I think short of that would be to have committee chairs be elected by the committees instead of appointed by the speaker, to have the telecommunications, utilities, and energy committee, whoever is on that committee, they collectively get to decide their leadership, and that democratizes who is making those decisions. I think that would be a valuable intervention. But I think as much as specific rules changes, I think we really need a culture change. I think like we saw that again, like when we passed I think that there was this effort to have the term limits, and they passed the term limits. And then as soon as the term limits pushed up against power, the term limits were repealed in service of that power. And so, I do think policy changes are important, but at the end of the day, we really need culture change within the building. And I think that means more champions like Rep. Robinson standing up and speaking out. And I think that does mean, as Greg and others are working on, replacing some of the folks who are currently there with people who are willing to speak truth to power and work to change the culture within the building, so it's no longer aberrant to speak out and say, I think we should get more than 2 days to read a bill, or more than 2 hours to read a bill before we're asked to vote on it. I think, like for that to be an outsider position that you have to have courage to say, I think, points to a fundamental cultural problem within the building.
I think those are both brilliant. So have committees vote on who leads them, and not having committee leadership be an economic perk. Any other responses to that?
Yeah, I would just add that, I think it's literally so much worse than you could possibly imagine. Anyone who's not worked in this state, it's hard to fathom how broken it is. They're really, and it doesn't need to be this way. There are 49 other states that actually do a much better job than us. There are plenty of states where you can track a bill every step that goes along the way. You can see exactly what wording changes have been made, where the bill status is, and so the tricky thing is that rules reform in the hands of the current leadership will not change things. And in fact, replacing the current speaker will not change things, because Representative Mariano is just going to get elected and it'll be exactly the same as what we've had. It does require a culture change. It does require new leadership. It does require breaking this grip that a specific type of person that has held that office of speaker for decades before we're going to see a change in culture. And it does require, again, a thing I want to stress for everyone on this call, and I'm thinking about you, my mom out there, you have to stand up to your progressive rep. You have to say, you cannot claim to be with me on climate or police reform and then vote for the speaker. There's only one vote that matters, the vote for the speaker. If you're voting for the speaker, if you're voting to perpetuate this corrupt culture, you are voting against climate action. You are voting against police reform, as we've seen, and we're voting against driver's license and sanctuary state status to support immigrants. That's what a vote for the speaker is, right? And any progressive who tells you about all the bills that they've co-sponsored and everything that they've done and then votes for the speaker is selling out your causes for their power, money, and their their feelings of influence.
So maybe you don't want to be at the Nadeau house for Thanksgiving this year. They will have a lot to talk about. I know Maria has to go, so let's thank her. You were wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us and lending your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me. And on behalf of Rep. Elgardo, who sends her regards and deepest regrets for not being here, just thank you to the 100 of you that are on here for caring about your state government so much. That's so important, and it's such an essential step. So thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative.
So let me just share the other states that got an F for transparency next to Massachusetts are Alabama, Nebraska, and Kentucky. Those are our partners. Right, kind of puts you off. Okay, let's take some more questions. And I'm also interested, we're left with about an integrated approach. So biodiversity for a livable planet offers a profoundly interesting vantage point on an integrated approach to addressing climate. How do we get our legislature to look at all these things in an integrated way as they pass and we try to move to a livable world?
I was fiddling with the setting. How do we get the legislature to look at climate change comprehensively?
To look at an integrated model for addressing the climate crisis. So you have this organization, Biodiversity for Livable World. They do wonderful things. They talk about how the earth can retain carbon, how we can farm in better ways, what we can do, and other people are on we need to transform our heating systems. We need to, so there's so many things happening. Is there a way to get our legislators to look at this in an integrated way, or is it all going to be piecemeal?
I think there have been efforts to take an integrated approach. I don't know that specific legislation has been folded into other efforts, but certainly, Senator Pacheco, for one, is a very big fan of the omnibus approach of cobbling together a lot of different important climate policies. I think one challenge we face in the climate issue, just to be blunt, is that climate change is a hugely widely encompassing issue. It involves everything from home heating to public transportation to agriculture, to some fairly complicated economic energy systems and methane leaks. There's so many facets to this. And I think for a lot of legislators, it can be intimidating when a lot of them didn't study this academically, that they don't consider themselves experts in every single issue. I think that there are certain folks like Rep. Robinson, thankfully, who have a strong background in this. And so I do think really approaching those who know and who are seen as climate leaders, and ask them to help educate their fellow legislators. But I think, again, as citizens who care about this stuff, I think educating legislators is a really important role that we have to play, because I think a lot of legislators do care, they want to know more, but they don't have access to all the information. And then there are other legislators, honestly, who don't really want to care or don't really want to learn. They're not interested in this. They have other issues that they're really passionate about. This is not on their top 10 list. And so they really just want to look to others to see what they, how they are voting. So yeah, I mean, I think honestly, if there was a quick, simple way to pass every single part of climate change we cared about, we would have done it by now. But I think it's that slow, long, hard work of democracy, of educating our legislators. But again, I think as we're talking about tonight, it's not just about education. That a lot of legislators have been educated on things like carbon pricing. There've been really long-standing, dedicated efforts, comprehensive efforts to speak to every single legislator about it, and yet we don't see action. And I think that is a reflection of the power politics in the building and the influence of the utilities, which I think we haven't really mentioned tonight yet. But I think part of the challenge is that, if our issue was that we all wanted to get a stop sign on Mass Ave at this one intersection, and no one was really opposed to that stop sign, we would have a stop sign by now. But the problem is that, there are these publicly sanctioned monopolies that really like the way energy is distributed right now. And so they have been fighting vociferously against some of these reforms that we've been trying to push. And they've been fighting that with money. They make donations to members of the legislature, particularly those in leadership, as well as the governor, and then use that financial contributions for influence and access. And so that is a big part of what we're up against. And so I guess just to name, I think one other tool we have in our toolbox is the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge, asking political candidates for office to swear off contributions from utility executives and lobbyists, as well as other fossil fuel companies. I think that's another piece of the puzzle here.
So between the extra money for doing committee work and then investments from these companies, we can't call them, are we allowed to call them bribes?
Those are campaign contributions. They're not handing them cash that they can spend on buying new furniture or a flight to Tahiti. It's money that they use to fund their campaigns. But
the money from the speaker is money that is their personal money.
Yes, indeed.
And yep. I forgot, what's the number? Maybe Craig, what number of the 160 House members get the leadership salary boost?
I don't know the exact number, but from what I recall, it's Democrats have like 130 some of those seats, and it's a majority of the Democrats. So it's 65, 70 folks, I would guess, are either chairs or vice chairs on the House. Or in other leadership positions. And
just remember, this happened, right? This was, I forget when it was, like 3 years ago, right? Or 2 years ago when this happened. It was passed as an emergency rider associated with a judicial salary bill, right? And so they did this emergency increase, and it wasn't an increase in legislator salaries. It was only an increase in salaries for leadership. It was just a move to consolidate power, because now you have the majority of the House members who are effectively being paid more by the speaker so long as they go along with what the speaker says, right? And so that degree of consolidation and corruption and betrayal of public trust. And I do, my sense is that it really is quite different in the Senate, right? That there is much more open deliberation. And the result is that we actually have gotten more progressive climate legislation passed through the Senate. Now, you said that there was quality in both, but my understanding is that the omnibus climate bill coming out of the Senate includes carbon pricing, right? And that there is comprehensive legislation coming out of the Senate. So it's not like we're asking for something radically different. Just look, 30 feet away at the way that the other side of the legislature is working and start behaving that way. And it all starts with changing the culture, moving away from this old corrupt culture that has dominated Beacon Hill for decades, and looking outside of Boston, outside of a particular kind of type of person who continues to bring a particular culture.
So here we have a very relevant question from Roger Luckman. I'm hearing that we need a speaker coming from a different culture. How is the speaker elected, and is anyone going to run against DeLeo?
So the speaker is elected by the other representatives, and it's not a pure party vote. In theory, Republicans and Democrats collectively get to choose who the speaker is, though in practice, because Democrats have a supermajority, the Democratic caucus usually gets to decide that question. But again, it takes a lot of courage to vote against the current speaker. The penalties for voting against the speaker tend to be any bill you file this session is dead on arrival. So good luck to all of your pet projects. It could be your local Girl Scout troop has a really important, park bench they want built. It's a really simple thing. And the speaker will just say, no, you voted against me. So I'm sorry, all those 12-year-old girls are going to suffer because you had the audacity to vote against me for speaker. And again, that is not the DeLeo rule. That it has been the rule, generally speaking, for quite a while now. And I think to Greg's point, like we need a collective movement to say that is not okay, that we cannot have one person unilaterally deciding through their pettiness what gets passed to the legislature. It should be, bills should pass on their merits, not based upon whose name is next to the bill and what their current standing is with the speaker. Like, this is not high school. This is our democracy, and
So
real lives are at stake.
What do you think is the best way to leverage that 91% of people in many districts that actually voted for transparency? How can we use that and move it?
So I think someone asked this question earlier. So yeah, so there were 16 districts out of the 160, so only 10% of the districts, unfortunately, passed referendum. So there are non-binding ballot questions in 16 districts saying, shall the representative from this district be instructed to vote for blank? We did 2 of those questions. In 19 districts, we ran questions around 100% renewable energy by 2040. And in 16 districts, we ran saying that all committee votes should be publicly transparent on the website of the state legislature, the state house specifically. And so I do think for the representatives in that district, I think there absolutely need to be conversations from citizens from those districts saying, hey, 91% of voters from your district told you to do this, so you better do it or have a really, really good reason for why you did it. And again, there isn't really a good reason for why people should not be able to see how the representatives are voting and serving in service of them. So I do think we need to hold those people's feet to the fire and be very clear to other legislators that we were collecting these signatures during a global pandemic, when it was really hard to stand outside of grocery stores and go door to door saying, please sign this. Though many folks, including Judith, actually did do that. Yeah, and so, I think that we are likely going to do this again next session if people do not behave and vote according to common sense transparency measures. And so that pressure is just going to keep building. And so it would be better for folks to get ahead of that pressure and to demonstrate courage and principle in this moment.
Okay, let's take 2 more questions and then we're going to wrap. There were a couple hands up in the participant list. Matt, Sam, do you want to unmute? Can you unmute them and they can ask, or do they put their questions in the chat? 3 participants have raised hands too. Can you bring on your questions? They wait patiently.
I think Kurt is unmuted.
Go ahead, Kurt.
Sorry, I didn't mean to unmute.
Does anybody want to ask a question from your voice box?
Yes. This is Roz Windsor. I thought this has been excellent. I'm wondering, and I wish I had known more ahead of time so I could have told more of my friends to tune in. Is this recorded, or is it somehow, could it be available belatedly to other people?
Yeah, it'll be on the website.
Good. The Act on Mass website?
The Act on Mass website is listed in the chat.
Sorry, this will be on the
yes.
350 Mass website. That's where the recording will live, on the 350 Mass website, which is the host of tonight's event.
Okay.
And if you
Thanks.
want to contact Act on Mass, the contact is in the chat. Sorry.
And I should say that 350 Mass and Act on Mass are the 2 organizations that partner together on those 2 ballot questions this session.
Okay, somebody else want to unmute and ask your question?
I think, Ted Wade was. And
We are
John
waiting.
Grossman.
I can go, but I don't want to step in front of somebody else.
Go
If
ahead,
someone
John.
else has.
Ted is still muted.
Sure, go ahead.
My concern is that political leadership can usually find ways around rules. And if we say, I'm in favor of all these changes, I think it will certainly help the legislators do their jobs better. But the leadership, I think a lot of, they could just stop co-sponsoring. People will stop co-sponsoring bills because they'll come up with some excuse about why they should never co-sponsor a bill. The leadership won't bring bills to a vote. If they bring bills to a vote and they really don't want people to pass it, they will explain that to the legislators. And I think that happens now. And I just have a feeling that if this could be a bit of a rabbit hole, we need to build a movement to pressure them to deal with the issue, just like Black Lives Matter did. And that's what it's going to take to get them to deal with this stuff. Changing the rules will help a little bit, and I'm all for it, but I fear it being somewhat of a distraction. So I'm wondering if you all could comment on that.
I mean, I'll say that I have concerns that rules reform will not have enough of an impact. I definitely share that concern, that in the hands of the current corrupt culture, then it will not actually change things in a meaningful way. Now, there could be rules that are much more profound. I think that, someone put in the chat secret ballot for speaker, although in general you would want transparency on bills. You could imagine a secret ballot on speaker being something that that is democratic. I like the idea of no pay increase for leadership. I think that would substantially reduce the amount of power of leaders if they're not able to effectively bribe the majority of their colleagues with salary increases. That would change power. Committee votes transparency, I think, would be helpful, as well as to just track bills. And the one other thing I'd put out there is local control bills. There's a big part of what the legislature does, which is basically hold up democratically elected local city councils and town meetings from doing the things that people want done. And whether those are liquor licenses or home rule petitions of any type, there's no reason why the Great and General Court should have to act on something that is effectively going to be voted and controlled by people. Decisions should be made as close to the impact as possible. It shouldn't be the speaker who's holding up whether or not a particular community is able to get a local home rule bill passed. It's just one more way that you have to keep up this relationship with the leadership in order to do what shouldn't even need to be an issue in the first place, which is getting the legislature to do something that the city council has already enacted.
And just adding on to that, again, John, as I said, I think we absolutely need to change the culture. I totally agree. I think if we just change rules, they will find ways around the rules, or when the rules become inconvenient, they will repeal those rules.
Right.
Though I do think for things like co-sponsorship, I think that you're right. We would get fewer people co-sponsoring if co-sponsorship had more teeth to it.
Right.
But that would be good for us. Like right now, the problem is we don't actually know who's actually with us and who's with us, where they'll put their name to the bill, knowing that it will never come to a vote because the speaker will never let it come to a vote, and they can just get us off their backs. I think having more clarity around who's actually with us and who needs to be persuaded or defeated would be better for us. But again, I mean, if you look back, the environmental movement, I think it's our most powerful point in history was in the 1970s, when we passed the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, created the Environmental Protection Agency. All that was done under Richard Nixon because there was a broad swell of support after the first Earth Day, but also there was a list of the dirty dozen, the worst political offenders, who the worst polluters or polluter enablers in the U.S. Congress, and a bunch of them got knocked out in their primaries. And then very quickly, there was a race to see who could pass the best environmental legislation on Capitol Hill. And in just over the course of the 1970s, that decade really locked in all of the major environmental legislation that we want and need. And we need a similar effort. We need legislators to start losing their seats in primaries
That's right.
because of their refusal to vote for greater transparency and to stand for greater transparency and accountability within the building. And I think as soon as legislators realize that the greater threat to them is not whether or not the speaker docks their pay, but whether or not the people kick them out of office, that is when you will start seeing a change of culture in the building. And I think we were hoping to do that this election season. And again, I think unfortunately the pandemic really set back challengers. I know Anna Callahan is one such challenger who is on the call tonight. It took a good faith run at one of those legislators. I think we need more people to be willing to put themselves out there and to try. And so if you're on this call, I would really, really encourage you to think, who is my legislator? Have they signed the Act on Mass Transparency pledge? Where are they on climate? And if those are not resoundingly great answers, then you should run against them or recruit someone in your community to run against them. Competition is really good for democracy. And I think the more legislators see that they are being challenged on this, that the local debates feature these questions, that letters to the editor in your local paper are talking about this, op-eds are talking about this, like we need to make this a live issue. And it's only going to happen if good people who care stand up and put themselves out there and try running for office.
Okay, so as we have heard, it is very hard to be the lone legislator putting your neck out asking for transparency. So it is up to us, as they say, we the people, to really push in this direction. So join the Act on Mass initiative. Thank you very much for being here tonight. We are going to close. Thank you to our partners who co-hosted: Elders Climate Action, CCL of the North Shore, Mothers Out Front, Biodiversity for a Livable Planet. The music you heard in the beginning is called Politics and Poker from a great musical called Fiorello. Thank you, Greg and Craig and Maria, who's not here anymore. And the most important thing we can all do right now to bring us back to the beginning of our talk is contact your legislators and say, get the roadmap bill out of the conference committee, get it on the floor and pass it. So if you want a one go-to act out of this webinar, please do that. Let's get that bill out before they end their session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Judith.
Thank you,
Good night,
Judith. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Judith.
Thank you,
Good night,
Judith. Thank you, everyone.